All right, guys, welcome to the first of our MLB webinars for 2015. I'm Jessica Wellman, the managing editor of Pregame.com, and I will be moderating today. And David Malinsky, our editor-in-chief here at Pregame, will be hosting. Hello there, Dave.
You realize, Jessica, that to do a baseball webinar, the appropriate thing is for someone to shout, "Play ball," real loud. Can you do that for us?
No. No, I sure can't.
Okay. Well, guys, this is what I've got to deal with in here. Joining us today to talk baseball from the inside out, a guy you're going to be able to interact with all season long, Dave Essler, sometimes known as Uncle Dave. I'm not quite sure why. We may ask that later on. Dave Essler, welcome in.
Well, welcome. Thanks for having me. I can give you the quick answer to the Uncle Dave. That's an RJ thing.
Okay.
I'm not that creative.
Okay, well, let that go for now, then, if it's an RJ thing.
Well, RJ was saying it's because you're so friendly and responsive in the forums, and I've found that you have been very friendly with me when it comes to all of the things I've asked of you, including your awesome NCAA write-ups and now this webinar.
I heard something different, but that's okay.
Uh-oh. Let's not get any rumors started. Really quickly, just so you guys know, there are the ability to submit questions. Sorry, I'm not the most PowerPoint savvy person. So we are going to have some polls that you guys will answer throughout the presentation. We're also going to have the ability for you to ask a question at any time. So if you want to submit those questions, I'll be keeping an eye on them, and we'll try to, if it's timely, have the two Daves answer them, or we'll save it for the Q&A at the end. In the meantime, though, Dave Essler, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background betting on baseball?
About myself, that's not my forte, but about myself is, this is what I do all day, every day, is try to find value and make bets. And about myself, how I got to this point, I think most everybody knows that story, but at one point I was on the other side of the fence, if you will, to where I needed somebody to help me because I didn't have the time. And then 6 or 8 years ago, I all of a sudden had the time, put the time in, and tried to become a little sharper, and now I try to share that with other people, and hopefully I can help them eliminate a lot of the mistakes that I made, which pretty much everybody probably does at some point in time. And that's a little bit about me.
Well, let's start the game now. I get to be Vin Scully for a moment, something I've always wanted to be. Shame living in Las Vegas the year of Scully's final as a Dodger broadcaster, because we won't get to watch the games, unfortunately. I'm Vin Scully. Dave Essler is walking towards the mound, getting ready for the first pitch of the baseball season. How does Scully describe Dave Essler? What type of pitcher should we expect you to be once the games begin?
Well, and because I knew you were going to ask that question, I had a chance to look up the answer, and I come up with Greg Maddux. And not because Greg Maddux is in the Hall of Fame, more because he throws strikes and limits walks, which to me is the way you win baseball games. And limiting walks is akin to me to eliminating mistakes that you might make betting. And the other thing Maddux did a ton of was study every single hitter, and he was just so prepared that, you know, if he lost, he knew why, and that enabled him to duplicate his mechanics. And I'm all about, whether it's baseball or basketball or pick a sport, if you don't have a system, if you will, that you can duplicate, you're really never going to improve. And so that would be a little bit about who I would relate to as a pitcher.
Now, notice a common theme we're going to talk about a lot in baseball and throughout a lot of sports, and it's going to be a little bit different here at Pregame. There's going to be something a bit more genuine. It's not going to be about wanting to be Randy Johnson and throw 100-mile-an-hour fastballs and blow someone out of the box. It is about avoiding mistakes. When someone says, how do you win? Well, the first thing towards winning is don't lose. Give yourself that opportunity. So now we are getting close. Sunday night they begin. We're getting opening day lines will be up in a couple of days. Dave Essler, what are you doing right now to be prepared for opening day? What are some of those processes?
Well, I'm going through all the depth charts one at a time because, as you or anybody else knows, there's free agents and there's free agents and there's free agents. And, even to the point of last time I looked, the Cubs weren't sure if Chris Bryant was going to start in AAA or not. So I'm really just trying to figure out, okay, who's going to play where? And that's what I'm doing a lot of. And it's very, we're going from basketball to baseball. So there's a lot of catching up to do, but there's a lot of refreshing for me to do. When I knew we were going to do this webinar, I had to go, okay, baseball, I have to talk about it. And some of the things I went through, and I neglected to even put down that I, look at umpires, especially on total or something that would be very simple that it's really easy to forget. So it's really just studying depth charts and to a certain extent spring training.
How much does spring training impact? Is this a day-by-day thing that you'll look at, or are you going to take some of the bottom line stats and incorporate them? How much does that weigh as opening day comes up?
Well, that's a good question. I don't look at spring training stats. Well, I'll put it this way. I don't look at player stats because, Mookie Betts is not going to hit 478. But one of the things that I have found over the years, and it's really interesting, is I do think a lot of spring training carries forward for, quote-unquote, some teams. And not necessarily the bad ones doing well, for typically teams that don't do well in spring training from a win-loss standpoint tend to not do well for the season. So I'm looking at those things. I could give you an example. I found a great one just looking at last year. If you look at the bottom 5 teams last year were the White Sox, Texas, the Red Sox, Minnesota, and Philadelphia. I mean, they were all had winning percentages less than 400 in spring training, and obviously they all did horrible all year. And all of them had, with the exception of maybe the Twins, reasonable expectations, if you will. I mean, I don't think any of them except maybe Boston thought they might win the World Series. But that type of thing tends to carry through, whereas I think the teams that are at the top of spring training, that may be a little bit sort of disjointed at this point in time because, there's going to be teams in there that have phenomenal records that just aren't. And they play so many split squad games, it's impossible for me to correlate player stats and take that forward into next week.
Okay, let's do another spring training step because a lot of the listeners we know have written in and said, okay, what are these sources for the off-season information? So when you're preparing for 2015, what are your favorite sources that you can share with people that'll help them to get a jump?
You mean in terms of what websites I might look at? Or?
It could be website. It could be hard copy things. I must confess that I'm still one who gets the hard copy baseball prospectus because I like to carry it around the house and read it in different places.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't have time for that. Nor do I have the patience for it, to be perfectly honest. So I will go on, I'll start strictly with MLB.com or ESPN, just going through depth charts. I'll basically just refresh myself with, okay, where were we at the end of last year? And what have these teams done to address their shortcomings this year, and do I think it'll work? I guess an example of that would be the Padres is a good example for me in that last year they were horrible against left-handed pitching. And I mean horrible. I don't remember the record. It was, 10 and 35. It was some really, really bad number. And so this year they go out and sign Matt Kemp and the kid from Tampa Bay there, Will Myers, and Justin Upton and Derek Norris. So people are going to assume, well, now they're going to do really well against left-handed pitching. Well, they might, but what's the other side of that coin? Does that automatically translate into, okay, they're going to do the same this year against right-handed pitching? So I will look at the new additions, and in this case, if you look at Myers, Kemp, and Derek Norris, they're all pretty horrible against right-handed pitching, so are they going to suffer on the other side? So those are the types of things I'm looking at to sort of, hopefully we can gauge that fairly quickly.
Okay, so as we get to Sunday night and then the full card on Monday, when you've got those ideas worked into your philosophy, is it come out firing now at those early numbers? Are you more cautious early? What's your approach to those first couple of series as they're played?
That's a double-edged sword. I mean, will I come out firing? No. And one of the reasons for that for me is every bet I make, I want to learn something, especially if it doesn't win. And when you're already in that information gathering stage and you're kind of overwhelmed, you could go on a teamrankings.com and just go forever. Trying to simplify it and pick a handful of teams that we're going to keep a really close eye on that we think we have a really good handle on. And I think it's really, for me, it's not the uncertainty, because every bet you make has an uncertainty to it. It's the able to keep a grasp on what I'm doing. Does that make sense to you, David? You would probably understand that.
It does, because there's always that question early in any season is that, do you want to get a jump on the marketplace with certain ideas, or do you like to let the season itself evolve? I know that myself, I'm much more aggressive early in college football, in college basketball, maybe even in the NFL, than I am in baseball, because even if I think the market might be slow to something, you sort of have to let it play out and let it evolve. It's like the things that we think are going to happen will not happen as immediately as they can in some of those other sports. So let's work through these processes.
Well, I think from a mindset standpoint, and this would kind of go directly against a sabermetrics person that's strictly going to plug in numbers and come up with an answer, which is not me. You got to take the emotion out of it as much as you can. And I think that's true of all betting. I know it is. But if you go ahead and bet half the board or all of it, and you win 3/4 of them or more, that can have a real tendency to give you a false sense of security. And conversely, if you bet 8 or 10 games Monday and you win 1 or 2, you're going to instinctively, or I would instinctively think, okay, what am I doing here? So I really think that sort of more methodical beginning for me is going to pay much greater dividends down the road. And it's true in any sport for me, the same way in college basketball. We tend to flounder in the early stages, and then once we've got sort of a handle on what's going on from January on, we'll do real well. And last baseball season was almost a carbon copy of that, in that I think by the All-Star break, I don't think we were ever up a lot or down a lot. We just kind of went along. After the All-Star break, I think we won 40-some-odd units. And I don't expect this year to be that much different. I hope it's not.
So, guys, you'll notice that since Dave was talking about some of the resources that he used, we have the first of one of our polls up right now asking where you go to get your baseball information every day. So feel free to click and check that, and we'll update you on the results here in a few minutes.
And along those lines, let's get into the season now. The first pitches have been thrown because you've talked about accumulating that information. What are your day-by-day processes? Are you someone that will be watching the games, or are you someone that will be just charting the box scores and digging into the statistics? Where do you get most of your insights from?
I watch the games, and particularly the ones that I bet on at night, for sure, because there's things that the box score won't tell you. And again, that gets back to I'm not saber-driven, if you will. A good example of that would be an error is not always an error with a capital E if you're strictly looking at box scores. The first baseman may be charged with an error that could have been a throwing error, but what they won't show you is the 3 great picks he made that either were inning-ending double plays or saved throwing errors. That doesn't show up in a box score to me. And a lot of times I'll get things from watching the games simple little things that, that's not simple at all. An umpire may be squeezing a particular pitcher, and that has a psychological effect on, the pitcher's next game, or down the road, the pitcher's going to see that umpire again, and you can't get that from a box score. So at night, I will watch the majority of games, or flip back and forth, or click on highlights. Absolutely. And I don't think that's no different for me than any sport, but I think probably baseball more particular because, it's kind of like we talked a little bit ago. You can go on ESPN or MLB or Team Rankings or StatFox, and you can get more stats than you could possibly ever process. But there's some things that just don't show up in a box score, to coin a phrase.
And that's kind of the magic, from a handicapping standpoint. So one of the things we want to get people prepared for, you'll get this from Dave Essler all summer. Well, you're going to get this almost every day in the point blank columns when we get to baseball. Those box scores and stats get treated as gospel. In every sport, there are things that go into the box scores and stats that are just flat out wrong. Made reference to one earlier this week on the pregame radio show. If you watch Duke play Gonzaga in basketball on Sunday, Duke had 2 turnovers in the game. The box score shows 3. Where's the third turnover? Last possession of the game, Mike Krzyzewski, respecting the sport, says, you know what, we're going to dribble out. We're not going to shoot. We're just going to dribble the shot clock away. That goes in as a turnover. No, you do not penalize a team for that. And here comes, I'm going to say, the magic of baseball, because this is going to frustrate a lot of people, but it's also where our edges could come from. Every double goes into the box score as looking the same. Some are balls that are just creamed and go off the wall in left center. Some are broken bat bloops that just hit the chalk going down the right field line. It's being able to discern between those things that makes such a big difference. So I like hearing from someone like Dave saying that he watches the games, because sometimes that's the only way you can get that information. Now, in this process, as you're watching each day, when it is time to track the box scores, is time to track the stats, again, are there preferred places that you will be going to that some of the people plugged in here might want to know about?
In terms of box scores?
We could say box scores. We could say stats. Who has the best? And 2 ways. Best not only in terms of the way they crunch the numbers, but when you're in front of the screen a lot, who presents them that's easy on the eye, ways that they can be digested, where you could maximize your processes?
Well, I'd like to come up with some really obscure Taiwanese website that nobody knew about that would make me sound really smart.
It would if you spoke Taiwanese. I think people would be very impressed.
I don't. You know what? I look at ESPN, Dave, because when I'm looking at the box score, I think the one thing I look at when I go look at the box scores is pitch counts. And ESPN will break it out into not just pitch counts, but also balls and strikes. And I sort of digest that information. And other things I look at, and these again would be games I did not see. And what I'm looking for are things I didn't expect. And why? It's kind of your thing of every double is not a double. Well, every team that gets 8 hits in the box score, and you may see they scored 6 runs and had 8 hits. But if you look at the box score, those hits were all spread out, and they were 2 grand slams. And that doesn't mean the same as, to me, everybody up and down the order getting a hit. In other words, they're playing good team offense and getting the key hit with runners in scoring position, which is a big thing for me. So that's what I look at when I go back and look at the box scores, and I get that right off ESPN. And I'm sure there's more elaborate box scores, but then again, it gets back to there's only so many hours in a day, and some of those numbers they don't have time to mean anything. I mean, people think that we're really smart, and I think we really just have more time and can eliminate more variables and make less mistakes, and that's what I try to do, and that's where I get That's what I get from the box scores.
Well, the good news, Dave, is that even though you don't know a Taiwanese website, you are in good company. 57% of you guys who voted said that ESPN was your primary source for MLB knowledge, and 29% said others. So I'd love to hear you guys. Let me know where you're getting your info, since I'm going to try and get into baseball this year. And, speaking of having time on your hands, we have a great question from John Tesco. He asks, I've heard some handicappers watch every single pitch or every game. Surely that's not realistic. And even if so, how much expected value does that really translate to?
Well, there's no possible way to watch every pitch of every game. I mean, that's, from a time standpoint. But I will watch all of at least 2 games every night live, and probably parts of a third. I mean, no, I can't watch every pitch of every game. I don't know that anybody could. And I think even if you could, that would get back to TMI. I mean, there's only so much you can do with all that information. I think when I'm watching the game, I'm just looking for little things, body language, interactions between the manager and particular pitchers, things like the Red Sox clubhouse debacle of 2-3 years ago that maybe somebody should have picked up on that sooner. So, no, I don't watch every game.
And let's talk about something on that front, too, because you talked about sabermetrics. We're talking about some of these little subtleties. One of the keys to baseball in terms of beating the market, and I don't feel like we're giving a great secret away because people will continue to behave the same way, there are so many statisticians involved in baseball betting, and their processes are so predictably linear. And that's not the right thing to say in terms of people understanding, but let's put it this way. Here's what you're going to read in a lot of written analysis, and you're going to hear from a lot of handicappers in audio over the course of the summer. This guy's 6-1 in his last 7 starts. Let's bet on him. This guy's 10-2 in his last 12 against this team. Let's bet on him. There's so much straight line thinking in baseball that a lot of times where you can find that great value is, you know what? He's gone 8-1 against this team with a 2.12 ERA, but he shouldn't. Considering the lineup, maybe instead of 8-1, maybe he should be 5-4. Maybe the ERA should be more than a run higher than it is. It's the inability I see in a lot of people to want to bet those corrections. Is that a part of your process? And is that something you can learn more from watching games than you could from a box score?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure I totally understand the question as much as, I mean, you're speaking mainly of trends. Is that where you're going with this, Dave?
Let's simplify. Let's use a word, and I'm going to maybe try to make this a common word in point blank. Let's say regression. And that if you think a guy's true ability, we'll use pitching because it's probably the easiest example. If you think his true ability is to have about a 3.50 ERA, and he's sitting out there at 4.8, that willingness to bet the guy to come back to his norm, which the markets tend to not do. The baseball markets love momentum. They love for anything that's going in a direction, whether it's good or bad, to continue its direction. Is part of your philosophy being able to step in and say, you know what, this pitcher's 2-6, his ERA's 4.80. I think he's better than that. I'm going to go against the markets and get the good value to bet for his numbers to come back to where I think they should be.
Oh, I can give you the short answer to that, no. I guess that would sort of pertain to what I like to call, and you probably know it, the do theory, if you will. As Team A has won 8 in a row, they're due to lose. No, I look at every game, every bet as a different thing. Now, I guess I totally agree with you about sort of teams winning and losing, about the market and being streaky, and I don't think you want to bet against a team that's 7-0, but to use your example of a pitcher, do I think he's due to regress? Maybe so. Am I willing to put my money on it? No. Not if it's a large enough sample size.
And let's go inside of that another level, too, because we've talked about pitchers and teams both. In your approaches, what would you consider the weighting to be for pitching versus offense? Or, if it's this team is hitting well, this pitcher's throwing well, where does more of the weight go? And even if you want to go beyond that, difference between starting pitchers and the bullpens.
Well, I think the weight always has to go to the pitcher. I mean, you're kind of 1 against 9 or 1 against 8 if you're in the National League, and that one pitcher that's hot is going to get the better of 8 hitters, in my opinion, and over the long haul. As far as the bullpen goes, everybody talks about the bullpen and this and that and the other thing, but I don't think enough people put enough emphasis on the bullpen if they're making full game bets. An example of that I was looking at the other night, a couple of years ago when the Orioles made the playoffs, they were actually outscored, had a minus run differential on the season, but they won 75%, like 31-10 in 1-run games. That's huge. I mean, it would be very hard to duplicate. So I don't think people put enough emphasis on the bullpens, even though we talk about them. So to go back to answer your question, I would put pitching starting A and pitching bullpen B and hitting C.
Yeah, let's keep something in mind that I think gets forgotten a lot in the minds of the bettors in the daily processes. A lot of the big stores put up overnight baseball lines the day before based on the starting pitcher. Those lines tend to not move much at all given the bullpen usage the night before. And there are so many times we'll be watching the games come in, and here's a team that burns out their closer. Maybe the closer pitches, throws 30 pitches, and he's not going to pitch the next day. That's supposed to move the needle on the overnights. It still doesn't do it. That's where we can find a lot of those edges coming into play. So I guess let's talk about, as you break the relievers down, how much of your work is being done the night before as the games come in, or is it getting up early that next day to do that at a level? When are you comfortable to start pulling the trigger?
That's a very good question. And I think every situation is different. Often, I guess the answer to that question is either very early or very late. I will bet an overnight line early, or I won't bet until very late the next afternoon. And a great deal of that has to do with bullpens, but it also relates back to I don't think I could quantify that into it's always this way or it's never that way, because there may be a starting pitcher. They may have a team with a pretty used bullpen, or they may have a little more depth than you think, but they may have a starter going the next day, like maybe Max Scherzer, especially in the National League, he's going to give you 8 innings. So you're probably a little less dependent on the bullpen. So I couldn't tell you that, yes, in this case, I always do this, or in that case, I always do that.
Since we're talking about the difference between starters and bullpens and your approaches, it also comes down to what type of bets you're making. So in your portfolio, full game sides, full game totals, first halves, run lines, what does your distribution tend to look like over the course of a season?
I would guess, and I was going to look that up and give you exact numbers, but I would guess it's probably 65% both sides. It historically has been, and probably 30% totals, and the rest would be others, as in first fives. Now, that brings up another question of mine, or a way to process this with our pregame platform, is first 5-inning bets. I would probably make more, or live wagering, but the platform isn't set up for that. So for full games would be probably 2/3 of what I do, and totals would probably be 1/3 if you had to really simplify it. But in terms of first fives, there's a fair bit, and I think your next question would be how would I decide on something like that? And what I would do is I'll typically just look at every game and figure out sort of my knee-jerk reaction as to what's probably the best bet in that game, and then work backwards trying to justify it.
And how often does the run line come into play?
A lot early. hardly ever with a capital E in terms of laying the 1.5. A lot early. Underdogs on the road, plus 1.5. One of the reasons being you're going to get 27 at-bats, as opposed to laying the 1.5 with a home team that may be ahead by 1. Well, they're only going to get 24 at-bats. And what surprises a lot of people, and I guess at one time it did me too, is the huge number of games that are decided by 1 run. You know, depending on who you talk to, you know, it's between 25 and 30%. That's a lot. So run lines for me, probably almost exclusively, I could probably count on 3 fingers the number of times that I would lay minus 1.5 in a given season. And, you know, one of the reasons for that would be, you know, when we started this exercise, I looked at somebody like Clayton Kershaw, who would be minus 200 a lot. And I believe that 9 of his 27 or 29 starts last year were 1-run games. And 7 of those were at Dodger Stadium. So if you'd have taken him on the run line at home, you'd have probably got killed. But the Dodgers as a team, when they were minus 200 or better, were 12-2. So for that reason, favorites on the money line is a rarity. Occasionally I will split the bets. Maybe I'll take a minus 200 and a minus 1.5, which would correlate to a minus 1 if you can find it. Sometimes that would be an option. But even that, a favorite on the run line is pretty much not in my arsenal.
Yeah, there's only one time that it'll come into play much for me, and it'll come out of something you were talking about with bullpens. Every once in a while, you'll get a team with a very tired bullpen, and it's what we will call a take one for the team situation. You have like a number 4 or number 5 starter, and the manager says, look, kid, we need 5 or 6 innings out of you today. You might get roughed up. Please give me 90 pitches. Give me 100 pitches. Yeah, we're probably going to lose this game, but I'm going to have to leave you out there. Interestingly, you will find those occasionally over the course of the season, and we will talk about them. Of course, you know, in the daily columns to maybe set some of those up. But one of the funnest routes in all of sports, when you talk about that road dog on the run line, is when you shift gears after 8 innings. It's that magical feeling of that road dog. You've been hoping for 8 innings would do something right. They're now trailing 3-2 in the 9th, and you're shifting gears hoping they do everything wrong. You actually want your team to not score. You don't want that risk of them tying the game to go to extra innings where you might get beat. That's part of that little magic that we have.
By a two-run homer in the bottom of the 14th.
And that will happen a lot, and I can't wait for baseball to start, because when it does happen, here come the forums at night and in the morning talking about the bad beat. I did have a question that's come in from one of the people plugged in. One of the frustrations with the first 5-inning lines, a little higher vigorish than the full game. Is that something that does impact? So, you know, like, how far are you willing to go and say, okay, I got to lay $1.30 for the first 5. I could lay the full game at minus 20. Will you lay 10, 15 cents? How far will you go to keep that idea in play?
Well, that's a good question. And again, I think every situation is different. I guess personally, if I like it and I'm really convinced that the first 5 innings is the right bet, and there are very few ways I think we can lose it, I'll lay minus 150. That's probably my upper limit.
Let's take another one that's come in also, and it's talking about money management. We've got guys saying that in football season it's pretty easy. You've got all week to carefully think about what you're going to do. You know what your bankroll is. You have an idea how many games you're going to bet. Baseball money management, because for better or for worse, if we're going to be out there playing every day, there are going to be these cycles of losing 5 or 6 days in a row. Fortunately, there'll be the winning cycles of accumulating the bankroll, but money management strategies for guys looking to follow along, what would you like to say to them?
That's another very good question. I mean, and you had asked that about bet size, and for me, I don't vary my bet size. But people have to be smart. I mean, if you're going to bet 162 games or 6 months or 180 days times 2 or 3 bets a day, yes, that is a ton more than football. So I do think you have to decrease your bet size accordingly or be prepared for those 5 or 6 days. And that's another one of those questions I don't know if I could give every single person the same answer because everybody has different expectations. And that's a big thing for me with trying to advise people, over the long haul if we're going to win or we're going to lose. What are your expectations? I mean, so many people have expectations of winning X amount of dollars over a season, and then there's other people that just want to bet and don't really want to lose. So I think you have to reduce your bet size if you're going to play every day because there are just that many more games. But I'm also confident enough in my own ability that I don't feel I'm going to lose betting the same amount of money every day because I do it so long, do it so often. So, that may come across as a little bit arrogant, but that's how I feel about it. I'm confident enough that I'm not going to lose money over the long haul in baseball or in any sport.
Okay, we've got an offshoot of that same question. And I'm going to phrase this in terms of a guy who bets $100 on a game. Okay, they're comfortable with that in football and basketball. They know 110 to win 100 every time. In baseball, if someone likes a game where the favorite's $1.50, do they step up and make it 150 to win the 100? Or do they still put that base amount, like 110, to win something smaller? And we'll do the flip side of that, too. If you like a big underdog, let's say taking 180, do you still bet the full 100 to win 180? Or are you going to go out and bet about $55 to get you the return of the 100? How would you alter your bet size based on favorites to get out into or underdogs in those realms?
Well, I don't. I'll be brutally honest with you that if I have a unit size, it is what it is, and it's easier for me to track. It's easier for me to understand. Some games I'm going to bet less to win more, and some games I'm going to bet more to win less. And I honestly think at the end of the season, I'm probably laying 120 to 125 at the absolute most if you added them all up and divided by 700, and then you factor in underdogs. It may even be less than that. That would be a good thing for me to go back and calculate because I'm sure that question is going to come up again.
You know what? In some ways, I like the fact that you don't calculate it because there are sometimes I think people do this paralysis by analysis, where they examine their own behaviors a little bit too much. I like it when I ask a baseball guy and he says, I'm genuinely not sure because sometimes that tracking influences our behaviors a little bit too much. Like, oh, gee, my average bet size is laying $1.28. I need to reduce that down. No, you take each day as its own entity, as it comes to you, and you just try to play through it.
That's the way I do it, and that's why I would advise somebody else to do it because you're absolutely right. It can totally mess with your mind, and who has time for that? And we have enough distractions as it is. I just don't. But the only reason I said I would calculate it as a curiosity for my own edification. It wouldn't probably take very long, and I would calculate it because my guess is somebody on the forums is going to ask, "What do you know?" And so, okay, well here it is.
Okay, we've got another question coming in dealing with one of these great sports universals, sample size. And baseball, we've got a ton of issues coming up. How does a team do against left-handers, right-handers? How does a pitcher do in certain situations? Evaluating middle relievers can be almost impossible. What are some of your standards for sample size to let you know when you're ready to act upon something?
Well, I guess that would be sort of specific to a lot of different things, but I could start that by answering a week is a sample size for me. I had said earlier that I put a ton of emphasis on bullpens, and I tend to work games backwards because bullpens are obviously the biggest variable. But I'll go on StatFox, and it's right there, the bullpen's ERA the last week, or the bullpen's WHIP the last week, which WHIP is, to me, ERA means nothing. The WHIP means everything. And if I'll see a team that's heading in a particular direction, that's usually a red flag. And so a week for me is a sample size. Another thing I'll do oftentimes is I will actually sort the entire league by the last week of their batting average or runs scored, and invariably you'll find a team that you think is doing well. They're in first place, and they're a marquee public team, the Dodgers, the Cardinals, what have you. And you look at the last week, and they're hitting 208 with 3 home runs. That's not something I want to back, so I would use a week.
This is going to tie into one that just came in from Bill Kinney also, and it gets down to the specifics. Is what exactly are you looking at to compare teams each day? That, okay, the Braves are playing Washington. What are those basic steps that you're going to be using in breaking down an individual game?
Well, where are they playing? What time of year are they playing? What kind of meaning does this game have? I'll look at the game situationally. A lot of times I'm, as you probably know, a little bit more into situational things, i.e. Team returning home on the first game of a long road trip is not something I'll back. The Red Sox playing in Houston on a Thursday night when they've got a series at Fenway the next night with the Yankees, no matter what time it is. So I'll kind of start there with, all right, what's this team's frame of reference, frame of mind, where are they at? And then I'll just go forward, and I'll work backwards. What did they do yesterday? What did they do the day before yesterday? How did they get to where they are, and how are they playing right now? And that's typically, before I really even looked at statistics and batter-pitcher matchups or bullpen rest, I'll look at how they arrived, sometimes literally, where did they fly from last night? A team, the Rays played a night game and they're playing a day game in Los Angeles the next day. I'll look at those types of things before I even get into who's pitching against whom and who has what bullpen and what team is hitting well. So that would be my first, so that before you even look at box scores and trends and stats and what have you.
And this is something that's going to be fun, I think, to talk about over the course of the summer for the little esoterics that come into play. And unfortunately, we don't have many knuckleball guys in Major League rotations this season. But it was one of these subtle little things that worked so well through the years, a knuckleball guy in a day game, because so many times a day game after a night game, players wouldn't take batting practice. And it made it even more difficult for them to get ready when there's a big change in velocity from the night before. There's all these little things that surround baseball.
Well, and they would typically have their own catcher, which would kind of mess up other things.
Yes.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And to take your point even further with knuckleballs, even now, I will almost automatically not bet on R.A. Dickey in Toronto when the roof is closed because there's no wind, because the wind will affect the knuckleball. And if he's pitching in Oakland where it's blowing 20 off the water, I'll probably bet on him just because the knuckleball is going to work better. And that would be my only basis for a bet, but that would be a point of reference where I would look further into it, or if he was in Toronto, I would probably just not do it. And that doesn't mean he never wins in Toronto. He always wins in Oakland, but the tendencies are certainly there. And I think if somebody were to go back and look at the statistics would back that up.
And that's one of the things we will talk about over the course of the summer, these little idiosyncrasies that simply don't show up in the betting line. And that's one of the keys out there, is the betting line is so stat driven. If Dickey is in a dome, or that knuckleball is going to be a little bit flat because there's just not as much moving air to interact with it, that's not going to show up. Dickey's game is going to be priced based on his stats and the stats of the opponent that he's up against. It's that sort of thing, that we're able to do, Dave, you and me, from our side, because we have the time to do it. It's what we focus on. It's what we do. Baseball offers so much more of that than the other sports. But at the same time, there is that daily challenge of keeping up on the information. Are you there every single day through the last out of the World Series, or do you take the occasional window? Or are there times where you see that the schedule itself tells you to take a little bit of time off?
Well, I don't know about time off. I mean, I can almost count on one hand in 5 years the number of days that I've just not made a bet. And that may be due to one thing or another. You know, from my perspective, for one thing, I owe it to my clients to give them the information. You know, if people would look at our college basketball, I would make a bet or two or four, but I would give them information on a bunch of other games if you guys want. So I can't, the only time I've ever really taken time, I've taken windows of time in a particular day off, because I think you have to have some sort of work-life balance, if you will, because if you don't, it'll drive you crazy. I mean, you can only stare at numbers for so long. You can only think about R.A. Dickey's knuckleball for so long. You have to go do something else to clear your head. You know, if you want to get into what those other things I do, we need another hour. But yes, I will. I don't take days off, partially because I think, especially in baseball, because it is changing every 24 hours, or less if there are day games. So I don't think you can afford to, if you're going to bet baseball seriously, I don't think you can afford to blink too much. And the times where I've had personal things that have got in the way, where, you know, a death in the family or something, where I've had to really not look at the ball for like a day and a half, I come back, I feel lost, totally lost.
Okay, well, you know, I think some of our guys can certainly sympathize with feeling lost. So with 10 minutes left in the webinar, why not take some questions and answer, or do a little Q&A session so that we can help them out. So guys, now's your chance to get your questions in. And of course, right now my questions disappear from my webinar. So I'll let Malinsky start things off while I fix this technical glitch. And guys, don't be shy. Ask anything you'd like.
You can do that, because I do have
a
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
I have a comment. I wanted to sort of follow up on something you said where the numbers are sort of specific. One of the things that you can find edges on is ballparks. I mean, we haven't even touched on that. We could talk for 6 more hours. But when you get into totals, I mean, a lot of those totals are almost ballpark specific. For example, you're never going to see a total in Colorado less than 9. I don't care if it's April. And you're probably never going to see one in Oakland more than 7, because Oakland is cavernous with a ton of foul territory, and as everybody knows, Colorado is not only small, but it's rare air. And that's where you can sometimes find some pretty serious edges, because I don't think when they put those overnight totals up, again, they're not thinking about last night's bullpen or last night's scheduling or those little idiosyncrasies we talk about.
And let's talk about a key component, and this will apply to almost every aspect of handicapping. There's preview and there's review. There's using that ballpark on a given day to make a bet. And then it's also that morning after, where that ballpark, because it did play a factor in the proceedings, the ballpark becomes a part of the review process. And I think one of the things people get used to reading at point blank is, as we do the review, we're going to look at a pitcher in the middle of May and say, okay, this guy's off to a good start, but be careful. He pitched at Wrigley when the wind was blowing in. He pitched against a certain team when a key hitter was out. It's using those ballparks as part of a review process, because over the course of a lot of seasons, things will balance out. The schedules will level out a bit. But in short cycles, you can get a poor pitcher out there who's going to be in Coors one night. His next start could be in Wrigley with the wind blowing out. Maybe an interleague game now where he's at Texas on a night where that wind is not favorable. All of a sudden now his last 3 starts look horrible. And when you look at the morning newspaper, that last 3 in the pitching line is going to look horrible. But the reality is it was the ballpark that did that. That's something we have to do in-house. I can't go to ESPN and see the pitchers adjusted because of the ballpark. In some ways, it's a shame. In some ways, it's a positive. It means I've got an edge. If I can do those adjustments, it's bigger for me. But think about how many of these games, Dave, you'd see through the years where a guy's in Wrigley on the wrong day. He goes out and he lasts into the third inning, gives up 7 runs, 3 homers. It can take 6 or 7 starts to balance out that one particular game. Are those the type of spots you're talking about?
Yeah, I would tend to bet on that pitcher next time around. If for no other reason, he probably only threw 48 pitches. His arm isn't tired.
Okay.
And I'm big on pitch counts. I mean, I'm huge on pitch counts. I mean, if you've got a pitcher that, I mean, I'll go to Max Scherzer or somebody that typically he'll throw 120 pitches every single game. But when you have pitchers that aren't, especially young ones, and you see they've thrown 2 or 3 in a row, 101, 105, 108, I'll almost look to get on the other side of that pitcher almost every time. Or at least it's not automatic fade, but it's not something I can comfortably get behind either.
It's one of these little magical things we'll talk about in terms of an edge. When a guy has a high pitch count, it usually meant a good game, which means people will like him the next time when maybe they shouldn't. And sometimes a guy will go out and get crushed and get pulled early. People won't like him. They'll want to bet against him in the next game. But you know what? When you get pulled early, you don't throw many pitches. You can come out a little bit sharper. One of those wonderful little ways we can use pitch counts to be opposite of where the market wants to go sometimes. You pick up a few extra pennies for the pocket that way.
Mm-hmm.
You guys were talking about how much pitch counts play a role in your handicapping. Dale Doback would like to know, how much do managers play a role in your handicapping?
For me, more so, not on, I guess they probably should, but what I use the managers for is who they may rest and who they may sit. I probably should factor that in there somewhere. I mean, I would obviously give an edge in a high-profile game to one manager over another, but I have found, an example of that would be somebody like La Russa when he was on the bench with the Cardinals. He was kind of the Major League Baseball version of Greg Popovich, where they would be playing the day game the next afternoon, and you could almost count on nobody regular being in the starting lineup. So from that aspect, I'll use that. But in terms of their managerial in-game decisions, I don't factor that in, and if there was a way to, I would love to know about it.
Yeah, it's one of these things that we can't quite use the way we do in basketball or football, where we can talk about a Popovich. This week we can talk about, a John Calipari, which just makes Jessica smile so much through that info. We could talk about Bill Belichick in football. For the managers,
that would make me smile.
Now, for the managers, you fill out the lineup card, and there are a lot of games that go by where they don't have to do anything outside the book at all. It's something that I honestly haven't found a way to use significantly in a handicapping process yet.
All right, we're getting a lot of questions that are more focused on futures bets like the division pennant, the World Series.
Guys want to win money, don't they?
Win totals for the regular season. Any recommendations on those teams you like this year for those kinds of bets?
I don't do a lot of futures, I'll be honest with you. Dave may. I mean, I'll look at them, but if I do futures, they're typically to potentially hedge out of later. I mean, I have some opinions. I'd be glad to share them on the forums. I've looked at them. I found it very hard to believe that they have the defending American League champions as about the 9th favorite to win the pennant this year, when they really only lost James Shields and Billy Butler, who are both replaceable, at least stats-wise. But I don't do a lot of futures bets, but I'd be more than happy to take that one to the forums.
Yeah, and I'm going to sort of join you on this, and it's going to be a little pet peeve because it's someone I'm going to have lunch with later this week. We've talked about a guy named Eric Strasser, and we'll talk about a few other good baseball handicappers in the point-blank column. It's while we're in the heart of college and pro basketball, working our tails off in January, February, that guys like Eric pretty much come in and clean out the market on the baseball futures. We want to thank them so much for that. Thanks to Steve Fezzik also, by the way, who will hook up with those guys, and they'll get out and grab all of the good stuff in futures because we just don't have, or I don't have the ability in the heart of basketball to be as prepared as possible. I will follow some pretty good people, but the problem with the futures is they won't let me follow them until they've played first. And it's sort of like showing up about an hour before a restaurant buffet closes. There's not much left, and nothing fresh is getting brought out.
Okay.
The other thing to that is that I, to make it worthwhile, I really don't want someone holding my money for 6 months.
Makes sense. Dale Dobak apparently does have someone holding his money for 6 months, though. He says, I've bet Toronto to win division plus 200. Should I light my ticket on fire?
Well, I'm going to take the fifth on that one because he might live in Toronto. I would never light any ticket on fire. I mean, who picked the Royals last year? I mean, baseball is the one sport you can go from worst to first very quickly. So, I don't think any bet, if you've honestly thought it through, is a bad bet, unless it's totally an emotional bet, and then you got no one to blame but yourself. But, in terms of Toronto, I mean, I don't see a team in the American League East, that's going to jump out and run away with it. I'm from Boston, and I worry too much that they have Ramirez and Sandoval because that's a small park with big egos, and we've seen that movie before. So
there are some of us who are looking forward. Some of us, they were looking forward to Ramirez trying to figure that wall out.
Oh, me too. I tweeted that. I said, that'll be a SportsCenter top 10 within a week.
I just picture in my mind him standing and watching, and, oh, wait a minute, I'm supposed to go get that. It is such a gamble of all places to put him in front of that wall, but I think you answered the question real well. If somebody has a Toronto ticket, you're in contention because no one's going to win 97 games in the NL East. All of those teams have their weaknesses. So, no, you are in the hunt, at least for a while, with that ticket.
Oh, I agree. I'm waiting for Hanley to throw one from sort of left center field after he's chasing around and to throw it into the visitors' dugout in third base. I mean, it's going to happen.
All right, we're going to do one more question and then wrap things up. John Walker's asking, what websites have information on pitch counts?
ESPN. If you go to ESPN and just sort, just click on a particular player, it'll give you his entire game log.
Yeah, ESPN is good for that because one of the great things about the box scores in this modern era, almost all of the daily box scores now will not only have the pitch counts, but they'll have the breakdown of strikes and balls as well. So when you just pick out your site for this year to chart box scores, look for one that has that. Not only pitch counts, but balls and strikes. ESPN's got it pretty readily available right now.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I use.
Great. And guys, by the way, I think I saw in the forums that Sleepy J just started a thread on baseball resources. So be sure to go and check that out. In the meantime, if you enjoyed chatting with Dave and Dave today, if you want more MLB insight from Dave Essler, you can get 25% off any of Dave's picks packages using the code EsslerWebinar25. One big word, EsslerWebinar25. If you're looking for other ways to find his insight, be sure to follow him on Twitter at Dave Essler, ESSLER. Or, as he said, check out the forums. Dave's always in there, very quick to respond, as is David Malinsky, with all of your baseball insights and questions that you have.
By the way, guys, Jessica came up with those peanuts. Wasn't that just beautifully done?
It's black and white and artistic. So I thought I would end on this pleasant note. It's been a pleasure speaking with both of you guys today. Dave Essler, thanks so much for joining us. And Dave Malinsky, thank you so much for hosting.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for letting me in your office, by the way. I wasn't quite sure where this was going to happen. Outside of that Kentucky thing hanging on the wall, kind of a nice place. And there also, by the way, there really is, this was put in a forum once, and it really does exist. I can confirm this. There is a Cincinnati Bengals stationary cube on this desk. We're not making it up. Yeah, I'm not going to ask any questions about the Reds. I don't have high hopes for this season. But
One can always dream. All right, Dave and Dave, it has been great talking with you guys. Thanks so much for joining us, and we're going to go ahead and call it a day on the first of a series of webinars on the MLB. Thank you.